Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, May 1st, 2023. And today I'm going to share with you what I see as the top 5 roadblocks to liberty. Now, some of these could be in or out of order, and they can change based on the week, but we're talking about things like obedience, fear, ignorance, and more. Not in any particular order, but using the wisdom of the founders and the warnings of the old revolutionaries to tell the story. I want to start out right off the bat with the first one. There's way too much obedience. There's a society of, well, if government does something wrong, we got to go to the government to get the government to tell us that the government did something that they shouldn't have been doing in the first place. In other words, wait for some part of the government to admit its error and stop the other part of the government. And this is really just a culture of submission and obedience to the founders and old revolutionaries. Here's James Otis Jr., who put it this way: "There is nothing," and this is a paraphrase, "there's nothing, however, that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges." Nothing. The number one way to destroy liberty, according to James Otis Jr., in 1767, is to just submit and wait for the government to do the right thing. He obviously was right. Here's John Dickinson in his broadside against the Stamp Act in 1765. He said, "If you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country." And this was an argument to tell people to refuse to cooperate, to refuse to comply with the Stamp Act, even if they thought it was just a small inconvenience. Like, why do we want to risk our necks on this? He says, well, here's why. You voluntarily establish the detestable precedent which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. In short, soon as you give them the power to keep enforcing something by complying with it, and you don't make it difficult for them to push these things through, this establishes a precedent for them to do more and more and more. This is recognizing some maxims of human nature, that corruption attracts people to places of power, and once they get in power, they always try to expand that power, and they will use sometimes smaller attacks on your liberty as a test. And that's what Dickinson was saying as well. Again, in that broadside against the Stamp Act, he said, "The Stamp Act, therefore, is to be regarded only as an experiment of your disposition." And I believe in the original broadside, he put "experiment of your disposition" in all caps to really emphasize that. And he said, "If you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you." And this is something that has gone on all through history. You find times where people are just like, I don't want to deal with this. If you think about it, also in human nature, people who aren't the bad guys, they just want to live their lives. They want to, they've got to work hard to earn a living, to put food on the table, to put shelter, to pay rent, or pay for their home and their property. It's not easy. And then when you take into consideration the empires of the world in history and today, devaluing, debasing currency and making it more and more difficult for the average person to exist, and the taxation regimes and things like that. So people work hard just to exist, the average person. And then on top of it, the free time they have, they don't want to be fighting some monster state. They want to just spend time with their friends and family, relax, have hobbies and things like that. So there is a tendency towards this. And Mercy Otis Warren talked about this in her History of the American Revolution. She pointed out there is a certain supineness which generally overspreads the multitude and disposes mankind to submit quietly to any form of government rather than to be at the expense and hazard of resistance. Liberty doesn't come easy, and we're going to get to that in a moment as well. She said they become attached to ancient modes by habits of obedience, though the reins of authority are sometimes held by the most rigorous hand. Sometimes she's being kind there. Thus, we have seen in all ages, the many become the slaves of the few, preferring the wretched tranquility of glorious ease. They patiently yield to despotic masters. I'll link to this stuff in the show notes. I'll get to that kind of info in just a minute, but you'll want to read this all in context on your own time. So number one is there's just too much obedience. People are willing to comply over. I know there are areas where we see a refusal to comply, to refuse to cooperate. And of course, we cover that in our annual State of the Nullification Movement report at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. And we're seeing more of it than ever in history. But in comparison to the largest government, the largest empire the planet has ever seen, we're barely scratching the surface. I think the general attitude is comply and get new people in there to get rid of the government programs, comply, wait for government to overturn something, some court or something like that, rather than do what's supposed to be done, which is resist at the first step that they go beyond the limits of the Constitution, the first moment that they encroach upon your liberties. Anyway, so number 2 is fear. And one of the reasons that people do this is because they're afraid of the results. They're afraid of what might happen, or maybe they're afraid of someone else, and they think that the government is still, even if they're doing bad stuff, they still think the government's going to protect them against these bad guys. We see this a lot in foreign policy today. A lot of people who tend to be, claim that they're constitutional conservatives, they want to limit government domestically in some ways, but then they want to empower government in many other ways, whether it's surveillance or foreign policy, because they want to. They're afraid. They're living in fear. They're fear of foreign dangers, fear of domestic dangers, fear of their neighbor, fear of everything, and that calls on them. That makes them demand government protect them. But government, by ripping you off, is not defending you at all. Anyways, John Adams in 1776 put it this way, and of course you've heard me say this if you've listened to this show for any amount of time. I would just remove the word most from this statement. Fear is the foundation of most governments. Now, he was going on to say in 1776, the people here in America, well, they're not going to be ruined by this. This is a noble people, and maybe they were at the time, but certainly fear has ruled the day almost ever since. James Madison thought there was a problem with this just in 1798, just a few years after ratification of the Bill of Rights. He's concerned about the war fever and the ramp up to the Alien and Sedition Acts. And here's a letter he wrote to Thomas Jefferson, May of 1798. He said, "Perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad." And this is a fear-based response, because if people are afraid of some bad guys overseas, they're going to demand that government do more stuff. And when government does more stuff, they have to take more stuff, take more of your property to do it. And oftentimes the stuff that they're doing is more surveillance, more violations of your rights, more taxation, more debts, and the like. As Madison put it, armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. So he thought it was a universal truth. So even if it's a real threat, people are willing out of fear to give up their liberty in order to get some kind of protection. But they will also do the same for pretended threats. And the politicians, of course, recognize this, the tyrants, the despots out there, and there's so many of them, they're so willing to play upon the fears of the people, have them fight amongst each other while they increase their power all the time. Here's James Otis Jr. one more time. This was, I think, in 1762. "So long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters." So whether you're afraid of some foreign threat, and you demand the domestic government protect you, but it really isn't, or you're afraid of the domestic government and you're willing to submit because you're afraid of what the consequences might be. And of course there are. We have to be realistic about that. We don't want to stick our necks out on everything. But as long as there is this culture of total submission and fear of taking a stand, we shouldn't be surprised that we continue to find masters, and they're worse and worse as time goes on. So long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters. So number 2 is there's too much obedience, there's too much fear, and then we also have kind of a lack of courage. We don't have much of what, for example, Patrick Henry had to say in 1775. "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And he was far from alone in that mentality. That's kind of the phrase that we all tend to remember. And it's not like he's asking someone to hand him liberty. He's basically saying, unless you're going to do the right thing, I will fight you to the death in order to get that. And that's what Nathaniel Greene said as well. He said, "I am determined to defend my rights and maintain my freedom, or sell my life in the attempt. So liberty was the primary object. And of course, that's a big part of what we need here as well. Thomas Paine put it this way in The American Crisis #4. It was a series, you've heard the phrase, these are the times that try men's souls. That was December of 1776, but he didn't end it with that. He kept going with a series of these. And in the fourth one, in maybe the fall, September or so, 1777, he said, those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigues of supporting it. It takes courage to stand against the empire. I mean, let's be real here. I don't do it enough. I don't think anyone does it enough because we recognize that it's dangerous and we don't want to upend our day-to-day lives at some degree. We want to just exist in some level of comfort. I know I do. Anyways, here's John Dickinson in his 12th letter from a farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767. He says, and he's a moderate. Remember, Dickinson was the middle-of-the-road guy. He wasn't the radical like Paine. He wasn't, the guy who flip-flopped the bit, was a little bit more radical at one point and a little bit more big government, monarchical, as we could call it, like John Adams. He was middle ground. And he was saying, like, if they're following the rules, you should obey government. And I know some people aren't going to like that, but that's his position. But he said, and I think this is the vast majority of the time anyways, especially when we're talking about what we live under today, nothing close to the Constitution, as James Madison described it, a government of few and defined powers. Almost everything they do is not authorized. So this fits in almost every scenario. He said, when these officers of the government, he said, through rashness or design, desire to enlarge their authority beyond its due limits, and expect improper concessions to be made to them from regard for the employments they bear, their attempts should be considered as equal injuries to the crown and people, and should be courageously and constantly opposed. That's John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution. As I mentioned a minute or so ago, if you want to find all these references that I'm mentioning in this episode, read them in context on your own time so you can learn more, because I'm just scratching the surface. I publish a blog post for every episode about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done. So a couple hours later today, I will get that published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And there you're going to find a show link section. So when you're thinking, hey, Bolden, where's that Dickinson letter you were talking about? You'll be able to find it linked there. And almost all the time. I think I get about 90% of these that I cover posted in the blog. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. I also include all the various platforms we're on. I know some people use just one platform. That's their favorite. But some people are not too happy with some of these major platforms, and you probably shouldn't be. I can understand that. So we want to be on as many as possible. Whatever your favorite is, we want to be there. If we're not there, please let me know. Otherwise, you can find us live streaming at rumble.com, Odyssey, of course, YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Twitch and LinkedIn, and the mainstream ones. We archive the video as many places as possible that don't allow us to do live streaming, and we have the audio-only podcast edition. So if you want to find all those in case we happen to be missing from one someday, again, that will be over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Just a quick look over in the live chat. I appreciate you guys spending some of your time with me today. I hope your Monday's off to a good start. I want to say hello to Haji in Michigan, Dixie Strong, Alt Reality, C&T Designs and Arms. Sup, perps? That's awesome. King Nobody, Senator DT in Elkhart, Indiana, Devil Dog in Michigan, Salt Lakers, Liberty Gal, good to see you. Have been a while since we saw you here for the live show. Thanks for being here, Liberty Gal. Devil Dog, Cowboy Roy Rogers, and Jonathan, and everyone else. I know I'm missing a few people. I just wanted to say hello, and I really appreciate you spending some of your time here, whether you're here for the live show or you're watching or listening later on in the archive. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty is where you're going to find all the stuff. So some of the things that we're having problems with is there's too much obedience. People live in fear. Maybe we have a lack of courage to take a stand. It's very difficult. And these are all real considerations because it's not easy to do what needs to be done. But we're also missing, I think, a big part of this, and maybe this should be number one. The foundation for it really has to be a love of liberty, because if you don't truly love freedom and you don't want to see it happen, why would you even have the courage and the fortitude and the lack of fear to go forward, to push on for something. And I think that's probably the primary missing ingredient we have today. Here's John Adams back when he was one of the good guys again, 1763, maybe 1765, his dissertation on the canon and feudal law. This is one of the earliest books I read from the founders. I had no idea what I was doing at the time. I think I was glazed over half the time. But there's some really good points that he makes in there. And he said liberty must, at all hazards, be supported. Or Patrick Henry in the Virginia Ratifying Convention was complaining that by the time they were proposing the Constitution, things were so much different in the summer of 1788 than they were back in 1765 or in 1773, when his attitude of give me liberty or give me death was incredibly popular. Liberty was the primary goal, and that's what he was talking about here during the ratification debates. He said, when the American spirit was in its youth, the language of America was different. Liberty, sir, was the primary object. And that's in his June 5th speech. You could call it Liberty or Empire. He said, either we're going to have freedom or we're going to have an empire, a grandiose empire. Which one do you want? He wanted liberty. Well, we certainly ended up with empire. But that's the primary object. John Dickinson put it this way: as a foundation and security of all the rest, I wish you a true love of liberty. If you want to be happy, you want to be free, you want to be prosperous, you want to be successful, the only way that you can get there, that's not going to guarantee it. The only way that the majority of people at least have a chance to get there is through a true love of liberty. And when so many people have a love of liberty, government is going to be pushed out of the way because they will resist them when government does the wrong thing, which for us today is constant. So number 4, I guess, I think might be the biggest one. We're missing a love of liberty, not from you or I here. Of course we do, but we need millions and millions more who aren't just on board with liberty when the other team is in charge, because that's what happens most of the time. Anyways, as a foundation and security of all the rest, John Dickinson, I wish you a true love of liberty. And then the last one here is also a big one: ignorance. Ignorance of what freedom is all about, ignorance of how to defend it, ignorance of the Constitution, what the government is authorized to do. There's so much ignorance. It's all around us. In an age of information, we live in incredible ignorance today. Ignorance of our history, of our founding principles, and the like. Here's Benjamin Rush. He said, freedom can only exist in the society of knowledge. Without learning, men are incapable of knowing their rights. Freedom can only exist in the society of knowledge. Samuel Adams, of course, recognized that because of this, governments, their tools, their supporters, tyrants, is how he put it, of course, they want to keep people ignorant and distracted and dumb. And maybe that's the whole goal of the government-run education system. I know Jefferson was a big supporter of the Virginia education system. He wanted to see, so many of them were. And I think that was probably one of the big mistakes that we've all made, is by allowing government to be involved in education. Because if government's involved in education, is government going to teach the people how to resist government when government does the wrong stuff? That would be a pretty unique situation, but I think over time, as government grows, that kind of thing would be removed. And as I talk about these types of founding principles, and, I'm 50 years old, so I went to school a long time ago, and I didn't learn much of the stuff that I know today. But I often hear from people who grew up 10, 20 years earlier than I heard about this one or this scenario. At least they heard some of the things. And I think over time, they teach us less and less and less. History lessons, in essence, when you're talking about the Revolution, the Constitution, things like that, it's just about dates and battles and times. It isn't about the founding principles. I did the episode regarding Lexington and Concord, 1775, talking about how, this wasn't just about, they weren't getting into a shooting war in order to get representatives so the representatives could tax them. What really led to the shots being fired was the British marching on Concord and trying to confiscate guns and ammo. And really, it was a gun control program that set things to the next level. But I wasn't taught that. And I know many people, as I did that episode, told me the same thing. I never learned this lesson. And the less that they teach us, the more power they get to keep for themselves. And that's what's my short version, or my rambling version of this short quote from Samuel Adams, who pointed out that it is in the interest of tyrants to reduce the people to ignorance and vice. As long as they're dumb and distracted, government power is going to keep growing and growing and growing. And Jefferson put it this way in a letter to Charles Yancey, 1816. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. Learning is something that is not attained by chance, is how Abigail Adams put it. It must be sought for. You have to push for it with vigor. So unless people are really motivated to learn, because the stuff that they're being spoon-fed, I mean, if you think many generations of government-run education, the stuff that we're getting spoon-fed is all garbage, or there's little bits of truth in there, and the rest is garbage. Anyways, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. I think Thomas Paine summed up all of these together. So we're missing a love of liberty. We've got lots of ignorance. We've got lots of fear. We're lacking courage and way too much of a culture of obedience. And he recognized that the strength and powers of despotism consist wholly in the fear of resisting it. And I think that's a combination of so many things. It's without love of liberty, why would you have the courage to do something? Without knowledge, you wouldn't know this. And then, of course, you have the fear and the resistance that keeps them in check. Well, the fear keeps the people in check. The resistance keeps the government in check. And Samuel Adams put it like this in his great letter writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette, 1771. The truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. It's a 1-2 punch. You have to have people who not only understand what freedom's all about, they have to value and, well, want it. And then on top of it, they have to have the knowledge and courage and wisdom and fortitude and perseverance, is how Samuel Adams put it. Fortitude and perseverance to push forward. And even when you get a win, you never stop. You never rest satisfied with the efforts we have already made, is how he put it. Because that is the wish of our enemies. We have to keep pushing on and on and on. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. It's more of a quick take than I normally do on a Monday. I hope it was educational. If you want to help us get this kind of message out from the founders and old revolutionaries on what's needed to advance things from the largest government in history to a real land of the free, whether in our lifetime or set the foundation for the next, for the future. Nothing helps us get this kind of work done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have lifetime 5-year annual options. It's all over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Do not feel obligated to join us, but if you can pitch in, you feel compelled to support the work that I'm doing, other people like Mike Meharry, TJ Martinell, Alan Mosley, and so many others that have helped us out currently and over the years, that's the best way to do it. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Let me take a look over on the live chat and see if there's any comments or questions I can get back to quickly. Kirk Morrison said you quoted my favorite Virginian. Are we talking about Patrick Henry? Maybe Jefferson? There's a couple of them in there. But I appreciate you watching, Kirk. Hope you're doing well. I know you had mentioned setting up a surgery or something soon. Eyes, right? Salt Laker says George Carlin was right. Man, if I was... One of these days, I should just maybe do a short or a reel talking about some of the Carlin stuff because there's so much good there. Haji says we need to evangelize for liberty. Yes, and I think as I'm going through this, and I know I put these in some kind of an order, I really think ultimately the number one thing is that foundation for all the rest, which is a true love of liberty. Because as long as people don't really want that, you really have to have a motivation to accomplish something, to be able to risk your, well, our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor, whatever you want to call it, to take a stand, to resist, to nullify the largest government in history. It really takes something to motivate. So that has to be the foundation. And then, of course, maybe some of the other problems go away when that love of liberty is more prevalent in society. Anyways, I'll look over in the live chat a little bit later on today. I appreciate the comments, whether it's right now or later on in the archive. The archive comments certainly do help the algorithms on these mainstream platforms. So does smashing the like, subscribing, getting notifications, maybe even leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts. The more stuff that you do to interact with the mainstream platforms, the more it tells those platforms to show us to more people. Again, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your Monday's off to a good start, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.